All right, everybody, welcome to this evening's webinar with Dr. Madeline Barlow on empathy and the art of listening with the Drexel University Sport Coaching Leadership Program. My name's Cameron Casoglis, and I'm thrilled to have you with us on what I think is a topic that is probably timely at any given point, but particularly with all that we're facing. So I'm thrilled everyone can join us. And in the coming week, we've got another webinar tomorrow night with our creativity expert, Dr. Larry Kaiser. We're talking about winning strategies and innovations and creativity as it relates to our mindset as leaders in the sports space. And then next week, Chris Clemens from former national team, US national team field hockey coach. He's going to talk to us about mentoring, some of the work he's doing with some of the summer and winter Olympic sports with the US national teams. So just a quick review on some of the webinars we've had. Chris Snyder from the USOPC spoke to us back in June, and my dear buddy Tim McLaren speaking about the fundamentals of coaching with his 5 Olympic medals and even a 6th medal as an Olympic athlete. So lots of cool references and recordings on the website there. And Madeline, I think we've got already a couple of yours on that site, and thrilled that you can join us again today. We're going to be talking about empathy and the power of talking less, listening more, which I've been practicing. I don't know how successfully, but yeah, the art of using silence, listening, and certainly in the online space, it's been challenging, I think, for many of us to figure out how to navigate this landscape. So I'll hand it over to you to pop up on the screen your presentation. I think I put you on mute just for a second there, so off you go.
Great. Hi, everyone. So we tried this last week and it didn't go or 2 weeks ago, didn't go as planned. So today we're putting out that positive energy because we're going to get it done. I'm excited. My power went out unexpectedly. So it happens and we adjust and we pivot, and that's just how it has to be. So yeah, today we get to talk about empathy and how it applies to listening as a coach in particular. So I do have a slide show, not too hefty of one, but I do want to make this dynamic. So I want everyone to know, please, if you have questions, you have thoughts, you can pop them in the chat. And at the end, or, if you also want to ask a question verbally, if it's a bit too long, you're welcome to do that too. And Cam, as always, we can go back and forth, which is the best thing. It's so fun. Okay, I'm going to go ahead, share my screen. Okay, good. Everybody can see that? Awesome. Okay. Alrighty. So we're starting off with this quote that I really, really resonate with. So we think we listen, but very rarely do we listen with real understanding, true empathy. Yet listening of this very special kind is one of the most potent forces for change that I know. I really want people to hold that with them as we go along, because there's so much that resonates in terms of empathy, in terms of really hearing people, whether that's your fellow coaches and other individuals you work with, but in particular today talking about the way that we're listening, hearing, understanding our athletes. So really, what is it? It's this active listening and responding. So it's not just listening or hearing. It's the way that you're able to respond as well that will typically enhance this sense of trust and understanding, again, between you and whomever you're having that conversation with. And this was right where my power went out. So this was the last place that I got to, but I think the last thing I was saying that day was about this picture that I just really love, because this was me and my coach when I was swimming in high school. It was my last meet at YMCA Nationals at the University of Maryland, and it had the best of times. Literally, I did really well that day. So it was exciting to think about. But this was one of the most empathic, understanding, really dynamic coaching experience I ever had personally, and he really did listen. Listening was a massive aspect of the way that he interacted with all of us. So again, what's the point, right? Why do we want to enhance this authentic connection? Well, like I just said, it can enhance this positive coach-athlete dynamic, the relationship, and in turn, enhance well-being and performance, right? Because as we listen a bit more sensitively, so taking in, observing, it might even come down to observing body language when you're going through that conversation with your athlete, and you're really paying attention, understanding what they're saying. It helps that person to also understand things about themselves, things about the way they communicate, their thoughts, their feelings. So it goes both ways. It's this really beautiful conversation. And again, just simply, it will improve coaches' understanding of athlete and team culture, right? Team culture is huge. So understanding that, really paying attention to it is big and comes into this conversation. So how do we do it? These are the 3 ways that I wanted to bring to you. There's a number of other things that we can do, and we can talk about that. But these, I thought, explained it really well and with some nice alliteration of the 3 A's. Okay, the first, attention. So again, receiving the message, really hearing it in the moment, being right there where your feet are as you're listening and engaging in the conversation. So this requires you to focus more on what matters to them, what they are giving you, versus what you think about what they're saying. There's a time and place for that, but when you're hearing them, if you're bringing that empathic understanding and listening to the conversation, you're really paying attention to what they are trying to convey first. And then also show that you're paying attention by using nonverbal cues. So as you can see, I tend to use my hands a lot, but other things that really are just like slight nods when you're communicating. Eye contact, of course, is important, and other types of verbal cues, or not, and also nonverbal cues, to let them know you're really engaged in what they're saying. Okay, number 2 is ask. Ask them questions. Again, that's why I want questions to come into this conversation, just like any conversation I try to have, because it's how we learn. It's how we gain a better understanding. So ask them questions rather than just simply sharing your own point, right? Try to engage them in that way. It also builds that sense of mutual trust and connection. Paraphrasing is a really great way to do this too. So it's a question in its own right, but it's also, hey, you know what I'm hearing you say is, ... Is that right? Right? So because we want to be clear, we want to clearly know that we're understanding them or their point of view, so that we can best respond to that versus, once again, like I said before, trying to create our own perception of what they're saying. Hear them, ask, and then that tends to lead really naturally into better conversation. And then adjust. So like I was talking about earlier with having to pivot when things sometimes don't go as we want, we often have to adjust in conversation. So one way, again, is choosing your responses based on what you hear from your athlete, rather than having these set responses ready to go. So again, it requires you to be really in the moment with that person, and then you can truly respond based on what they are giving to you to receive. Release the need to listen with this specific goal or outcome in mind. And that can happen for many of us. We often listen to respond rather than listen to understand. So that's the adjustment we're actually trying to make here. So release that specific outcome for the conversation and simply reply. And then lastly, when your attention wanders, bring it back. Bring it back to the moment. Notice if your mind has gone elsewhere, or even if it's gone to just gone to that need for the specific outcome, specific response from them. Notice it, bring it back to the present moment so you can respond appropriately, and with that empathy and understanding. I'm going to give you a bonus one, of course, and this is not an A, but this bonus is something you can do outside of conversation and within a conversation. Practice sitting in silence. This was really hard for me for a number of years, honestly. It's, starting as a teaching assistant, but also being a coach, and then now doing the mental performance work I do. I'm in conversation often, but what was challenging is if the room went silent, really silent. And my instinct was to jump in with something else, to add more dialogue, because silence can be a little uncomfortable. So this skill, again, happens to be, not the skill itself, but the silence, sorry. The silence is where people often have these breakthroughs. It gives them that time and space to really process what is coming up for them, what they're thinking about, what they're feeling, and what they want to express. So giving them that time and space in silence can lead to huge breakthroughs, huge insight, right? Again, personally, it can come up. So this is a picture of me meditating. I think I was just taking pictures actually that day. I don't know if I actually sat in meditation. I'll give you that insight about myself, but I do meditate. So sitting in the silence, even just for a couple minutes a day, so doing that on your own is a really good practice, but also allowing there to be quiet in the room when you're either in a one-on-one conversation, even if it's a conversation, especially if it's a conversation with a bigger team, giving them all the space so they can respond in some way. Also remember that every conversation is different. Every person you're talking to is different, is individual, is unique. So acknowledge that. It really will enhance the conversation. It's also so important, though, to communicate your needs, allow them to communicate their needs, set ground rules. I think when Cam and I first talked about this, I was outside with sunglasses on. And so he made a really great example of this, if we're continuing to do things over Zoom in particular, right? If for some reason you're really wanting to see that person's eyes, say, hey, would you mind taking your sunglasses off for this conversation, right? That's okay to ask. It's okay to communicate that, and it's actually important. So that way you can have this deeper connection, or again, whatever the reason is for you, why that matters, why that's important. It's okay to set those ground rules. Then this last one I think is really important. Especially around the trust you have with your athletes in particular. Asking for consent to share details of that conversation with others. This is something that I do when I meet with my athletes. I always make sure if anything comes up that needs to be talked about, I still have that consent, that trust from them to share. Oftentimes I'm in my role anyways, I can leave names out if they're not necessary, but even to share anything that comes up for them. It's really key to let them know that they can trust you, and doing that through consent or permission to share is one way that you can promote that trust. That's all I have for this nice short slide, which I'm happy about, because I want this to, again, lead to some cool conversation. Anything that's coming up for people, examples, let's just chat about it.
Cool, Madeline.
Share my screen.
I've got a couple to get things rolling, and then if anyone wants to unmute and join the conversation, love to have you join us. Um, Boundaries. How to navigate that conversation when you want the person to feel heard, but you might not necessarily agree with what they're saying. Why don't we start off with that one? Showing when it's not necessarily agreement with the person that you're working with.
Okay. And one more time, actually, could you repeat that in just a slightly different way? So boundaries in terms of who is this conversation between? Just if you can dive in just a little bit deeper.
So yeah, maybe if you don't agree with the person that you're working with and you're talking to, but you want to show them that you understand what they're talking about.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And this is tricky, of course. Conversation can be tricky because I think often, no, it's a little bit different for everybody. Some people may choose to avoid something like a boundary because thinking that will, you're going to hurt somebody's feelings, or you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, really. You think someone will take offense to that. That's something that might come up for some people, and that will prevent the boundary being brought up or being held. But when it comes down to it, the key is to, again, allow people to recognize that we are all different. We are unique, and we may have different opinions because we're in different places in life. Let's say we're especially talking about coach to athlete, clearly different places in life, different life experiences. And I would argue that having that trust established prior to that is usually key. Yep. Right? When you have that positive dynamic already, it typically will lend itself to a bit easier expression of, I hear you, I see you, even. I don't agree, but let's talk about that. So rather than cutting the conversation off right there, it should lead to more conversation, more dynamic.
Okay, cool. I think that leads in nicely to a lot of the diversity and inclusion online conversations we've had of late. Of sort of there've been ground rules set or expectations of what the conversation will look like. So certainly in the online space, there's a lot more contracting going on. Where are you okay if we work within these ground rules, and if there's anything to add? I think that's probably another example of what you're talking about there. How about people that dominate conversation? Again, particularly online.
People who dominate. Sorry, you went out a little bit. Dominate. Yeah. Ooh, that's it. That's a good one. And I'll be honest. I can struggle with this. I think I can struggle a little bit with this. And like you said, online, for whatever reason, does feel a bit more challenging to jump in, if that makes sense. Whereas when you're in person, I think you can even feel someone's energy, and does that make sense? Like you can more easily jump your way in to the conversation or say, I'm going to stop you there for a moment. But honestly, that would be a good line. I have used that line. I hear what you're saying. Let me just stop you there for a moment. Yeah. And see if you can use that to effectively reroute the conversation. But again, I think dropping a bit of the, if I interrupt somebody, they're going to think I'm rude. Right? It's really more about the way you approach that interruption, and that it has intention and purpose versus just trying to shut somebody down. I think that's the key.
I know with some verbose people, we try to narrow their focus. So can you give me an answer to this question in 1 or 2 words? But I think it goes a step further. What about people that just don't answer your question? They just have an agenda and they just say what they want to say. How do you sort of, again, particularly in the online space where time is so critical, what are some ways to manage those that aren't very good at listening?
Yeah, because listen, I almost said because listen. Look at me, there we go. Listening is a skill, and it is a practice skill. So for someone who isn't great at listening, it's quite clear that they haven't learned the way to listen or the ways to approach listening. That's why I think this is such a great conversation, because we need to approach all of these as skills that can be learned. Just like in sport, every aspect of sport, more or less, can be learned and practiced. I think a key for this is continuing to ask questions in different ways. So it will take a little bit more energy from the asker, really, to, okay, how can I, again, reroute is the word that's coming to me for this. How can I continue to try to bring attention to a different way, or in a different way? Because it's true. Some people will just hear what they want to hear and respond how they want to respond. But also just you can always direct that conversation offline, or as in, like, if it's a group setting, maybe you could direct that outward, like out to another session. I really hear what you're saying. I think we should have a private conversation about that and talk a little bit more. So again, it's just the way you approach it. Sometimes it's just going to be tough. And if you're able to do that individually, that's usually a better setting, if that's how it was happening anyways, if it was going on in a team setting.
Yeah, it certainly comes back to that idea of where are the boundaries, what is the culture that you set. How do you interact with coaches as a specialist, a mental performance expert, in working with coaches to say, hey, you're a coach, you can't do everything all the time. When is it time to sort of tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, can you help me out with this particular athlete, or in this particular case with a given situation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for a number of coaches I interact with, I do so quite often, which I think is a key to all of this. And in general, the more you interact, the more conversation, the more listening you do in relationship with someone, the better it's going to be, or the more effective. It does take time. So I would say that the coaches I meet with most frequently are the ones that we have that really positive dynamic, and it leads organically into them allowing me to do the work I do with their team, recognizing the value of, that's not my role, right? Because they're hearing me too, which is what's cool. That's the whole point. When you can hear one another and like you said, step aside and say, okay, that's outside of my scope, but it's yours and I trust you. That's really cool. That's when the work is really so much value. So fun.
It definitely connects with a case or the case where athletes aren't necessarily feeling safe necessarily to share with a coach. How do you encourage coaches to allow their athletes to develop a voice so that it becomes helpful for the coach, but also we don't want another coach on the field per se. So how to elevate their confidence and the trust without it becoming having a negative impact?
Yeah, this is tricky because sometimes the root of the issue is that lack of psychological safety, like you were talking about, which really, again, is the classic example is, I have this problem, but if I go tell coach, he or she might not play me. They might take me out. They might think there's something wrong with me, et cetera, et cetera. Or if I say or do this, I'm going to get yelled at. And so having that fear or that anxiety around that is a challenge. So that's kind of where you have to work first, working on how can we develop that psychological safety as a team. And again, bridging the gap, really bridging the gap between the coach and the athletes themselves, working on communication on both sides, sometimes individually. So I'll try to work on that communication, me with that coach. And then also helping the athletes, lifting them, like you said, bringing them, helping them go inward so they can recognize, well, what do I believe? What do I feel? What does need to be said? Oh, and then how can I say that appropriately? How can I have that conversation? And then bringing it together.
I think that's a really good one to connect with. How do you tell the truth without it being hurtful? How do you dress it up so that it's not a punch in the nose, but the message still gets across?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind when you say that is not something that would have come to mind for me personally a few years ago.
Mm.
And that is that we cannot control how the other person will react and whether they will take it personally. That's a huge one when it comes to conversation, because it can often, that anxiety or worry around, what if I hurt them, will often stop people from having a conversation that's necessary. But like you said, we can't just go around screaming our truth in all fashions necessarily. We, you having that sense of a filter and what is appropriate versus not will depend on the relationship. That's really important. So it's very individual to the relationship, but still speaking it from the heart.
Mm.
I think it's really key. But knowing this is what I can control, the way I choose to say this, the language I choose to use, and then it's up to the other person to respect.
And it definitely comes back to the nature of the relationship, the authenticity that's being shared, the intention that's being shared. What about the generation divide? Someone asked a question about Gen Z, and I don't know. I don't know my generations as well as I probably should, because I'm not a big fan, but just in terms of those differences, how do we handle those differences? Either those that are super sensitive or those that sort of don't want to share so much. But what about those different generations, whether it's up or down, older?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's been very in my face the last few years, is working with Gen Z athletes, and I do feel they are different in, like you said, sensitivity is something I've noticed, and sensitivity has a bad rap. Like, people think the society has put a bad name to sensitivity, but really it just means they're paying attention. They feel more because they're paying attention. So in my opinion and in my work the last couple of years, that trust is even more important. That communication is even more important, so they can do what they know how to do, which is play at a stellar level. But they have to have that sense of trust and communication with their coaches. It's come up across the board, men's and women's teams, all different types of sports. That's just something I've seen pretty clearly. But even, then from me speaking with coaches who are older than me, so that's a gap as well that I've had to navigate. I'm a millennial, and so apparently millennials get a bad rap. I swear we're awesome, so I don't know what that's about. But like you said, the generation thing isn't super huge in my book. But I have had to navigate some, just with the conversation with some individuals who have been around the block in a lot of ways, have seen a lot of things, and helping them to rewrite some of the stories even, and how that's been influencing the way they interact with their athletes and with me. That's really important. It's a process.
Very good, very good. What about Sam asked a great question. What happens when someone's actions don't match their the words, when there's that contradiction? How do you like to acknowledge that there is that disconnect, that contradiction?
Yeah. So this one's tough. All of these things are a little tough, let's be honest. But this is pretty tough, because sometimes what's going on is a lack of awareness, really. Again, whoever it is that's having this disconnect between words and action, whether it could be an athlete who's saying, yeah, but I'm doing this and I'm doing it this way and I get it, but then their actions aren't aligned, or vice versa. A coach could be doing something similar. The key is to help bring the awareness to all aspects. Mainly, I would say to the behavior first, really trying to bring awareness to the behavior, because I feel words can more easily align, if that makes sense at all. But bringing awareness to the behavior, sometimes it takes, objective examples even of certain things, but also allowing them to learn the tools to tune in So teaching awareness is probably the number one skill I teach my athletes, but it does come up when I'm working with coaches as well, because we can all benefit from greater self-awareness. And when I provide those skills, so, what are those skills? Meditation is clearly one of them, but it's not for everybody. But really it's just, can I stop in this moment and just tune in? Where are my feet? What are they doing? Where are my hands? What are they? Simple things, simple actions, so that it will eventually translate. So again, a process that does take time. Sometimes if you're just like, hey, but this is what you're doing, it can be really triggering and may have an inadvertent negative effect or like a pullback. Whereas we want to help bridge that gap, bridge the understanding of the difference.
Yep, love it. I think that awareness development and you're really refining the questions to help someone feel supported, because it can't make anyone do anything. Really great question here from Gangadeep on the sandwich technique. Those that aren't familiar with the sandwich technique, I guess it's something positive, then what you really want to say, and then try and sugarcoat it so that they hear something positive the beginning of the end. I'm presuming that's what you mean by the sandwich approach, Gangadeep. Let me know if I've got that wrong. But Madeline, any comments on that one?
Yeah. So I'll be honest, I don't actively use it, but that's just me. I don't know. I think you can. I think it can be positive. However, sometimes the positive, we don't always need it. It really does act as a cushion. And again, there can be some inadvertent negative results from that, in terms of if we just keep giving the positive, the negative's not going to hit. It's not going to, we can feel a little bit of pain sometimes, and that's okay. We can learn from that if we feel supported, like you just said, Kian. Providing that support, that trust, that connection at the same time as discussing something negative or challenging, hard, whatever you want to call it. That's my opinion. I think there are times and places for that, because we all have positive things about us, which is great. We should be recognizing that for sure. But you have to go from conversation to conversation and recognize, is this the right time for that? So you can ask yourself that question. Is this the right time for that? Or do we really just need to try to navigate this more challenging topic or action, whatever it is?
Yeah, and Sam just shared a good one, a link there from the Harvard Business Review on probably not pro the sandwich technique. Anecdotally, I tried it with my wife and it was a disaster. So very good,
yeah.
not so good at home. I can speak to that one. So, but again, authenticity, right? If it's coming from the right place, do you really need to play around? Does it really need to be, hey, honey, I really like how? No, what do you really want to tell me? And so
sometimes, it can make it feel worse, even like, ooh, what are you trying to buffer right now? What's going on there?
Yes, and thank you, Sarah. Yes, never at home, the children or the animals. Yes, you're right. So good. Hey, this is not meant to be a therapy session for me, is it? Okay, I'll take it if it is. Asked another question earlier, and I've struggled with this one for around about 30 years. Meditation,
sure.
sitting quietly, and tips on those of us that try and either get distracted or, even better, fall asleep.
Oh, mm-hmm. What?
Tips to that one?
Yeah, so I've fallen asleep while meditating. I'm going to say that. For me, though, the key is start small. Start with a beginner's mind. In the same way, when you first started your sport, whenever that was, maybe many, many, many years ago, try to remind yourself of what it felt like to be brand new at something. And I'll be honest again for myself, like bringing that beginner's mind was a challenge, because after a while, I really wasn't a beginner in anything. I did forget how to be a beginner. But with meditation and with a couple other things that I've been bringing into my life recently, I've had to just break it down. So instead of saying, okay, I'm going to sit for 10 minutes, which granted for some people might not seem like a long time, it is. It is when you're first starting. Start with 1 minute. Honestly, it's totally okay to start with 1 minute of sitting and focusing on one thing. So everyone's a little different. Some people might like to focus on the breath. But when you do that, you can count as well. So you say in 1, out 1, in 2, out 2, or some variation. So you can have that awareness, that focus in your mind, because in reality, meditation will not allow you to clear your mind fully. It will not do it. Your mind will have thoughts. We are human. So that's kind of the key there, is really just break it down, make it simple. And when you lose focus or you fall asleep, just begin again. Keep it simple though. Oh, you're muted. There we go.
I love the increments, because I think, for those that hear, the transformation will occur when you sit in the lotus position for 10 days and don't speak to anyone. It's like, yeah, well, maybe, and not necessarily. So what's the goal of doing it? And I even found to the one on falling asleep, what are you trying to get out of it? Because sometimes falling asleep can be the best thing you do. Or if it is, constructive and you're trying to develop that skill, maybe standing up or put yourself in a position where it's not so comfortable that you will fall asleep, and being mindful of that.
Oh yeah. And there's other ways to meditate. That's a great point, because again, like the classic thought when I say meditation is, like you said, sitting in a lotus position, which I can't get my feet like that, first of all. So that's not going to happen. But really, you can start by bringing that mindful awareness to walking, to doing the dishes, to sipping your coffee or tea or water or whatever it is. Bringing that aspect of present moment awareness and focus to whatever you are doing in that moment is an act of meditation. When you're doing it, and if you want to keep enhancing it, the seated practice is typically the go-to. But again, as a starter, explore it in different ways that feel good to you. Standing, people do it standing, I believe. But sitting straight up in a chair, like maybe laying down just isn't the go-to way to do it for you. I sit in a chair, and that's been really good for me, but I get trance-like sometimes and just pass out. It's happened.
Yep. There's 3 really great questions here, and they're sort of all tied together, but we'll start off with it's all around this idea of building a culture of trust. So if you're working with an athlete, they're lying, but you want to continue to build that trust. How do you approach an athlete where what they're telling you is not the truth?
Yeah. That's a big one. That's a big one, because again, for some people, just calling them out on that won't be effective. For others, it might. So going back to how I was saying, each conversation is unique because the people in the conversation are unique. It will take you have to take your understanding of that person to begin with. So getting to know your athletes, this is one reason. There's so many reasons, but getting to know your athletes as much as you can is huge. It's imperative. So you can have the best conversation possible. Because again, if you call someone out, like, you are lying to me, just like that, like, I know you're lying, blah, blah, blah. That person may full on retreat and you're never going to get anything from them. Whereas another may actually really need that. Oh. So I think you can tell those things in other ways, like when you're just actively coaching them, like it's in their practicing, you can notice You can see the way they respond to some of the way you are coaching and what you're saying. So you have to go with the feel on that one. It's tricky though.
So in the case where you get it wrong and you call someone out and say, "Hey, you're 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 not telling me the truth, or I've got evidence, that's a lie," and it does get emotional. What are some of the strategies to be able to tackle those topics that do get emotional, and still keep that sort of, I hate coming back to the word boundary, but staying within the lines of what will end up being a constructive conversation, and what then just deteriorates into, well, that was a waste of time, or even you lose an athlete. They actually distance so far where you push them beyond wanting to participate in sport or in engaging with you.
Yeah. So when things get emotional, the number one thing I like to recommend to a coach is to take a break. If there is a lot of emotion, a lot of energy in the room, and that is more than likely coming from both sides at that point, clearly, which is okay, because emotion is okay. But what often is or will lead to that more negative type of, I don't know, conversation in general, but is when you just try to stick it out. You try to stick it out through the intense emotion, through the wave of the emotion, because more often than not, the words are just not going to come out right for anybody. It's not going to feel good, and you can lose trust on both sides really quickly. I read something really interesting too. Now this goes a little bit deeper. It goes into like the studies of like trauma and things like that. But being yelled at or being accused of lying can trigger something like that for someone potentially. But it's so interesting. What it said was that in those states, like the fight, flight, or freeze state that we can have in our nervous system, the language center actually shuts down.
No.
So genuinely, you may not be able to get anything out in the way you want to. So it just leads to ineffective conversation. So taking a break, say, hey, why don't we take a 5-minute break? Why don't we go take a walk? Like you go take a walk, you go to the bathroom, get some water, but meet me back here because I really want to go, I want to dive into this with you. I want us to come to an understanding and get through this together. Really highlighting that part too.
Yeah. And I think even you bring up a good one of going for a walk. Sometimes those more sensitive conversations are better off had instead of face to face in a room, one-on-one. It may be better to go for a walk or have another activity so that there is a little bit of it takes the edge off that emotion. But I think Sam brings up a really good question of in this day where the sort of open door policy, it kind of doesn't really hold true anymore because of the challenges of closing the door and having that sort of one-on-one conversation. So really I think we're all navigating this idea of how do you have an open door policy when you can't actually have an open door policy, when someone can't necessarily walk into the room, sit down and have a one-on-one conversation for all the potential misinterpretations or misrepresentations or he said, she said. So what are you guys doing in the profession, but also what recommendations do you have for us that want to have an open door policy, but knowing that you don't want to put yourself, the athlete, or anyone on your staff in a position where they could be putting themselves in a vulnerable position, even with the best of intentions?
Yeah. And this is another really tricky one because there's just a lot of layers to it. Like you said, perception is really important, and attempting to avoid misconstruing things, like you're saying, all of those are really valid to consider. I'm going to be honest, I don't know if I have an answer for this one in this moment. I think this one has a lot of layers here, and I haven't really considered this as much as I would like to. So I appreciate that. Whoever asked that, thank you for asking that. That's a great question. And I'm sorry that I can't fully dive into it. But as much as I can say is just, again, really gaining an understanding of who are the people that you want to have involved in that conversation. What's the dynamic already like between you and that person, so on and so forth. Even considering, like, now that we're doing things on Zooms, maybe we could even have some of those tough conversations that could be misconstrued through Zoom, because I think that's actually a pretty safe space to do some conversation, some work over that. That's what I'm thinking of in this moment, but I'm going to consider that one.
Sam's unmuted, and love you to share a little bit more, Sam, in terms of your context on the open door conversation.
Yes, please.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. I was specifically talking about, you hear this thing all the time from management, coaches, and everybody else. So, look, I've got an open door policy. You got a problem, come see me. Man, a lot of times I'm thinking that's BS. You really don't, because of that. So what if I seriously, I am the new coach, and I come out and go, look, I really do have an open door policy. I know the guy before me said that, and yet never did. So what can I do to convince that team that, look, it's not just a platitude, it's not just a throwaway line that everybody says. Now, I really honestly did that. Leaving aside the whole say sport, closed door, or more thing, I was not, Kim, you were way too literal on that one.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Because I have experienced something similar with a team where there's now a new. You're so right. They really do have this really amazing open door policy in terms of communication. We want you to come to us. We want to have those dynamics, right? Is that what you're saying more so? That you genuinely want that, and it wasn't present before. So now those athletes have this perception of it as like, that's not real.
Yeah. The last regime, they said that, but then every time we came in, it just, or they never made time for us, or it just got shut down or whatever. And I mean, we're seeing that now at so many Power 5 schools with allegations of, abuse, not listening, racial insensitivities, all that. And a lot of it goes back to, there was no way the players were communicating with the coaching staff. That culture was just not there.
Yeah, well, that's just it, the culture, right? So it's really doing a deep dive into how can we enhance the culture itself? What can we do around that? Again, there's a lot of aspects to it. One thing I did mention earlier was that psychological safety, because typically when this is going on, it's because there is a lack of psychological safety between coach and athletes, coach and team. So finding the ways that how to show that you are trustworthy, that you are genuine. This is what you want to give off. It's an energy, honestly. People can feel that energy, and you can still be, let's say, for example, you're like the hard ass coach. Like, you can still be a hard ass coach, get them to do what they need to do, giving off this energy of this is our team. This is important. We can communicate. We need to come together to be the best we can possibly be. I do believe it's a lot of the energy we put off and the small conversations we have, right? It doesn't have to be these big hour-long conversations. The little moments that you throw in throughout practice, throughout any interaction you have with them, really put that out there. I hope that answers that a little bit better.
Yeah, it's a great one. It's a much larger topic of conversation in terms of establishing culture, and we've talked about it, and we'll continue to talk about it. Of how do we stay current with it? Tenley asked a really good question about just some more examples of how do you politely interrupt a conversation, particularly when someone's you don't want to sound belittling, but the person you're talking to is just they're not hearing you, they're not listening.
Yeah. I don't have exact words for it, because I think it will be a little bit different based on what comes up for you and what you feel the most confident in saying and putting forward, which will be a little bit different depending on your personality, depending on your dynamic with that individual or individuals. So really bringing that authenticity to it. I really appreciate what you're saying. I want to interrupt you just so we can come back to that, or now let's navigate this. Let's try, it's a guiding. It's more like a guiding, you know, I'm going to stop you there. See how I'm even using like my hand. I know it seems kind of funny, but like I'm genuinely like using this, this nonverbal cue in addition to my words of saying, you know, I appreciate what you're saying. I hear you. We're going to stop there and move forward to this, or again, whatever that guiding is for you. I don't want to give you specific words because I think it's going to need to come from you in particular and what feels okay. So, because people will perceive that, people will hear and feel that energy you're giving them. So again, bring in some nonverbal cue if you can. Just, it's a little awkward. Let's just say it. It's going to feel a little awkward to interrupt, but that's okay. You can still reroute the conversation based on that awkwardness or with the awkwardness.
Yeah. And it's probably something that takes practicing, maybe practicing with somebody that's okay with you. You're testing it out and saying, hey, does this work? And again, the hierarchy, is it someone older, someone younger? Is it someone that doesn't have the skills? I know people have pulled me apart and said, hey, remember the other day when you, and I was off tangent and someone pulled me up and I just was completely clueless. I thought I was on track, and it wasn't until someone actually put my head in front of the camera and said, hey, have a look at this. I went, oh, no, missed up. So,
right. Well, it's an awareness as well. Like you said, sometimes we just lose the awareness of that or just don't have it in general. And that's okay. It happens. And so I would argue that, did you appreciate that? I feel like you might have appreciated that reroute. It sounds from the way you were describing it.
Initially, it was like, oh, and then,
right.
And then I felt like a moron. And then I walked away and went, yeah, that's really good advice. And so yeah. I think you know, for a lot of us, we're trying to do the right thing, and when you get it wrong, it's sort of a big ding to your ego, and so you sort of, the initial reaction is, oh, what do you mean? You get a bit judgmental and a bit defensive, and then it sort of, and then it can potentially calm down. So
absolutely, yeah, that's a great example.
Right. Yeah, the hierarchy piece is a big one. And as Sarah says, perhaps give both parties the opportunity to interrupt. And almost Sarah, in that respect, hey, can we play a game? Cam, if you're talking too much, Madeline is going to put one hand on her head. If she wants to shut up, it's going to be, Cam, enough. You know, and then she's going to pull out the enough.
It's not a bad idea for our next webinar. Now let's go with that. That would be fun, right? It's like, why are there hands on their head? What's happening? I love it. Yeah, but that's really cool, actually, giving permission, you know, at the beginning of a conversation to say, you know, if anything's coming up for you, I welcome you to interrupt me, right? And vice versa. You know, I want you to know that if there's something that we need to dive into or I need to stop you, recognize that we're doing that so we can move the conversation in a positive direction. Something like that. Yeah, that's acceptable for sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I hope that helps, because I know for many of us, particularly in the online space, it is kind of challenging. And I know with some of our new facilitators online, we've almost, you know, jokingly said, well, you know, if you're online, you can just always press the mute button. If you're the host, you can just press the button. I know that's not exactly the way we are, but playing around with this thing and trying to figure out the right approach. Here's one for you. I know we haven't thrown too many complicated ones at you, but what about this one? In the day now, we're wearing masks. You've got a lot less non-verbal to see. How are you adjusting and evolving to the idea of being perceptive to people's non-verbals when we, in some respects, can only see their eyes?
Yeah. So this is one reason why I'm not going to lie. I'm kind of glad that I'm doing online work for the time being, because it is tricky for me. I am big on really taking in someone's whole face, all the expressions, including the words as they're coming out of their mouth. It's really important. So I've struggled with this, you know, even in the grocery store when I'm in line, you know, trying to make sure I'm really hearing and responding to them in the best way. But I do think we can take things from body language as a whole. You know, we can even perceive how someone's feeling in terms of, are they feeling confident? Are they feeling really closed off and maybe unsafe even because the way their body is? I express a lot in my eyes though, which is good. And I think a number of people do too. So if you pay attention to these things that we've never really, truly paid attention to before, I think we can make some pretty big steps in communication, because now we're just being faced with this new thing. It's just one more way we can turn this into an opportunity for growth.
Awesome. Last one, I'll give it to Gangadeep. Again, great question. He said his psych professor told him that it takes 4 seconds to process auditory information. So we should wait 4 seconds before replying. What are your thoughts about that?
I think if that works for you and it feels good and aligned for you, yes. Because if it does take you 4 seconds, which again, I would argue everyone is a little bit different. So don't feel super rigid in the 4. However, if that feels good for you, great. And it also allows for a little bit of silence, right? 4 seconds isn't long, but it's long enough to acknowledge a little bit of silence. And like I was saying, sometimes that's where additional inspiration can come from, even if that's you as you're waiting. Awesome. I think it's great. I think I respond pretty quickly. I'm just going to say that personally. But I'm highly sensitive. I take in information really fast. It's just how I've always been. I observe a lot. And I'm super grounded in the moment now, which is amazing and speaks to all of the work I've been doing. It's exciting. But for me, I think I do tend to respond a little bit quicker. But I also find that sometimes I just need to stop and I just need to sit with that. And I'll even say that sometimes out loud, let me process that for a second. And that's been really helpful in the work I do too.
Yeah. Awesome. As always, Madeline, really appreciate it. It's always I always gain so much from our conversations. So lots of great strategies, and please, if anyone has any other questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out. I think you've put us in another spot, Madeline. We're going to have to bring you back again. We're going to have to
Sounds good.
So to everybody, again, appreciate your time. It's always great to have these conversations, particularly in these really, really bizarre times that we're living in. So you definitely, for me, I feel my feet back on the ground just a little bit more after our conversation. So again, appreciate it, and thanks for everyone for joining us, and we'll catch up next time.
Great. Thank you, everybody.